I'm selling this house. Pack your things. The words split the dead air of the dining room. A silver fork scraped hard against bone-white china. The sound was too sharp, too metallic. It echoed in my skull exactly like a spent 5.56 brass casing hitting a concrete floor. My steak knife stopped moving, halfway through a piece of medium-rare ribeye that suddenly looked like torn muscle. I didn't gasp. I didn't drop my hands. My eyes instinctively bypassed the man who just spoke and scanned the blind spots in the room. First the dark mahogany doorway leading to the hall. Then the heavy velvet drapes masking the floor-to-ceiling windows. Clear, no immediate physical threat. Finally, my gaze locked on Daniel. He sat across the long polished table, a lazy, arrogant smirk plastered on his 58-year-old face. The heat of the Georgia summer was suffocating outside, pushing heavily against the glass. But Daniel was sweating for an entirely different reason. He radiated the sour, unmistakable reek of cheap bourbon and deep-seated panic. His leased jet-black BMW sat in the driveway right outside the window, a desperate illusion of wealth for a man drowning in offshore debt and bad casino markers. He thought I didn't know. I knew everything. I shifted my eyes back to Walter, my father, 82 years old. A faded construction mogul choking inside a tailored gray suit. A tyrant who demanded absolute, unquestioning submission from his bloodline. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. My chest tightened. A dull ache settled behind my ribs. I didn't speak. I fell back on military muscle memory. Inhale for 4 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold for 4. Exhale. It's a sniper's trick. Box breathing. It slows the heart rate. It buries the rising panic under a thick layer of concrete discipline. You hear me, Olivia. Walter's voice boomed, rattling the crystal water glasses near the centerpiece. 61 years old, a completely failed marriage, working some dead-end, low-wage government desk job. You live under my roof like a damn teenager. You're a parasite. Daniel chuckled. A wet, pathetic sound. He swirled the amber liquid and melting ice in his lowball glass, refusing to make eye contact with me. I'm cashing out. Walter spat his face, flushing a dangerous mottled red. I've carried your dead weight long enough. Let's see how you like a roach-infested apartment down in the slums on your miserable clerk's salary. You're cut off. I looked at my plate. I laid my knife and fork down, parallel to each other, exactly 1 inch apart. The heavy silver clacked against the porcelain, a dry, hollow sound. I picked up my linen napkin, dabbed the corner of my mouth, and stood up. I didn't slouch. My spine was straight, shoulders pulled back and locked into place. I didn't look at the floor. I looked dead through Walter's dilated, caffeine-strung pupils. I reached over and took Walter's half-eaten plate. Then I reached across the wood and took Daniel's. I stacked them with absolute mechanical precision, not a single scrape. The silence in the room grew heavy, thick enough to choke on. Walter's jaw tightened. He hated the silence. He was a bully who fed on fear on the frantic scrambling and tearful pleading of a subservient family. He expected me to cry. He wanted me to beg for my old bedroom. My stillness starved him. It drove him insane. Don't you walk away from me when I'm talking to you. Walter slammed his fist on the table. I turned my back and walked toward the kitchen. The ceiling fan chopped at the heavy, humid air, pushing the sweet, thick scent of magnolia blossoms through the screen door. But as I pushed through the swinging kitchen doors, my brain misfired. The present faded out. Suddenly, I wasn't in a wealthy Savannah suburb anymore. I smelled the sharp chemical sting of iodine and bleach, the rusted metal of a makeshift field clinic in Fallujah, the metallic tang of fresh blood baking in the Iraqi dirt. I heard the deafening chop of medevac rotors. I saw the faces of kids Marines barely out of high school taking jagged pieces of shrapnel in the chest just to keep me breathing. I had watched men bleed out on dirty canvas cots without making a single sound. They died for a flag. They died for the person standing next to them. Compared to that, Walter's threat was a featherweight. But it still hurt. It was a cold, jagged gut punch. It bled because the hand holding the gun shared my DNA. A father throwing his daughter out onto the street just to finance his bankrupt golden boy son. He looked at my faded gray blazer and saw a loser. He had no idea he was looking at a woman who carried the weight of national security protocols in her briefcase. 10 days later. The yellow eviction notice was taped securely to my bedroom door. Official county seal. 30 days to vacate the premises. The paper felt cheap and grainy against my calloused fingertips. I stood in my room looking at the neatly folded stacks of plain, unremarkable civilian clothes on my bed. My cover was perfect. Too perfect. My phone vibrated on the wooden nightstand. Daniel's name lit up the cracked screen. I picked it up and swiped the green icon. I didn't say hello, I just listened to the dead air on the line. "Look, Liv." Daniel's voice leaked through the speaker, dripping with fake sympathy and real condescension. "Dad's really pissed this time. You pushed him too far. But I talked to him. If you come down here, get on your knees, and actually apologize for being a stubborn bitch, your whole life maybe he'll let you rent a room in the basement. Think about it. You can't afford rent anywhere else in this city." I stared at the eviction notice in my hand. The ink was bold and black. Have you ever been pushed to the edge by the very people you bled for? If you know this kind of betrayal, hit the like button, subscribe, and drop the word "survived" in the comments. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is right now. We all have scars. Let's count them together. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't let a single ounce of anger bleed into my throat. I folded the yellow paper down the middle. I ran my thumb along the crease, pressing it until the paper's edge was razor sharp. I folded it again into a perfect rigid quarter. I slid it into the inner pocket of my faded gray blazer. Talk to my lawyer, Daniel. I ended the call. Tossed the phone onto the bed. The defensive perimeter was officially breached. It was time to return fire. The barcode scanner at Register 4 emitted a sharp electronic chirp, a sound like a flatlining heart monitor. The Piggly Wiggly supermarket hummed with failing fluorescent lights and the dull drone of industrial refrigerators. Savannah's summer heat leaked through the automatic glass doors every time they slid open, bringing the heavy, suffocating stench of hot asphalt and exhaust fumes. I stood at the end of the checkout lane. The cashier, a girl barely out of her teens, chomping on blue bubble gum, dragged my frozen dinners across the laser. Her eyes flicked upward. They dragged slowly over my clothes. She took in the faded, off-the-rack gray blazer, the scuffed toes of my sensible black shoes, the severe lack of jewelry. I watched the calculation happen behind her eyes in real time. She saw a broke, middle-aged woman buying high-sodium trash just to survive the weekend. "Paper or plastic, hon?" she asked. The pity dripped off the word hon like sour milk. "Plastic, thank you." She bagged the items. As she handed them over, she sighed, shaking her head just a fraction. A pathetic little cluck of the tongue. Poor Mrs. Hodge. That was the whisper echoing around this small, suffocating town. They talked about it in the church pews on Sunday. They gossiped in the hardware store aisles, kicked to the curb by her own father, replaced by the son. I handed her a crisp $20 bill. She dropped a few coins into my open palm. I slid the change into my pocket. My face remained entirely blank. Not a single muscle twitched. Naval intelligence beat a very specific rule into my skull decades ago during interrogation resistance training. You never correct the narrative for unauthorized personnel. Let them assume. Let them build their false reality. Let this girl think I was a pathetic failure. She did not need to know that 12 hours ago, sitting in a dark, soundproof room on a secure satellite line, I authorized a drone strike and a high-risk mine-clearing operation halfway across the globe. I picked up my plastic bags. I walked out into the blinding Georgia heat. 2 hours later, the air inside Patricia Hale's law office smelled like scorched Folgers coffee and decaying paper. Her office sat above a struggling pawn shop on Bull Street. The wooden floorboards groaned under my weight. Dust motes drifted lazily in the slats of harsh sunlight cutting through the cheap plastic blinds. Patricia sat behind a massive scarred oak desk, 73 years old, skin like wrinkled parchment, eyes like crushed glass. She took a long, slow drag from a Pall Mall cigarette. The ash grew dangerously long, hovering over a pile of legal briefs. She did not look like a high-powered corporate defense attorney. She looked like a relic. That was exactly why she was lethal. She flipped a page in a thick yellowed manila folder. Walter's tax returns. He is bleeding cash out of every pore, Patricia said. Her voice sounded like heavy tires rolling over gravel. Your brother is draining him completely dry. Offshore sports betting, bad real estate flips, commercial loans with terrible interest rates. Walter is leveraging the family estate just to cover Daniel's margins. I sat in the hard wooden chair opposite her. I did not lean back. I kept my spine perfectly straight, my knees together, my hands resting flat on my thighs. Patricia exhaled a thick cloud of gray smoke. It curled toward the stained ceiling tiles. They think they are starving out a rat in the basement. A dry, rasping chuckle rattled deep in her chest. They have absolutely no idea they just poked a nuclear missile silo. I looked at the stacks of financial lies spread across her desk. My father's pride and joy. The grand illusion of the Hodge family wealth built entirely on sinking sand, unpaid credit cards, and toxic arrogance. Prepare the Hayes Trust Fund file, I said. My voice was flat, empty of emotion. Patricia crushed her cigarette into an overflowing glass ashtray. She locked her sharp eyes onto mine. No mercy, then. Do not hold back. Tuesday morning arrived with a brutal, humid heat. The Chatham County Courthouse loomed against the pale sky. Inside, the air conditioning hit me like a solid wall of ice. The smell of industrial floor wax and nervous sweat hung heavy in the long, echoing corridor. My low heels clicked against the black and white marble floor. A steady rhythmic march. A soldier walking the perimeter. Walter and Daniel stood near the heavy oak double doors of Courtroom 3. Walter wore a custom-tailored navy suit, a silk tie tightly knotted at his throat. He stood with his chest puffed out, looking like a powerful retired senator holding court. Daniel stood slightly behind him, already sweating through the collar of his expensive dress shirt, clutching a leather briefcase he hardly knew how to use. Beside them stood Coleman, a slick local eviction attorney with too much hair gel and a predatory grin. They were laughing. A loud braying sound that bounced off the high, vaulted ceilings. I kept my pace. I did not look at them. I focused my eyes on the end of the hall. An old bailiff stood near the metal detectors. Faded county uniform. Gray hair cut high and tight. He was slouching against the plaster wall, watching the morning crowd shuffle past with bored, tired eyes. I walked past him. The old man's eyes caught my posture. The perfectly straight spine, the squared shoulders. The measured 30-inch stride, the way my eyes scanned the exits. It was a physical language. Only certain people spoke it. Only the ones who had seen the worst of humanity. The bailiff did not know my name. He did not know my security clearance. But the buried muscle memory of the United States Marine Corps took over before his brain could process it. The old man instantly pulled his stomach in. His spine snapped rigid. His right heel came down hard against the marble floor with a sharp, echoing crack. He squared his shoulders directly to me. Good afternoon, ma'am. His voice was deep, guttural, and laced with absolute respect. It was not a casual greeting for a civilian. It was a greeting for a superior officer. I gave him a single, sharp nod. I did not break stride. I felt Walter's eyes burning into the side of my head. The arrogant laughter died instantly in his throat. I saw his heavy brow furrow from my peripheral vision. He stared at the old guard. He stared at my cheap, worn gray blazer. He could not compute the math. He did not understand why an armed man with a badge just snapped to attention for the daughter he had deemed worthless. The confusion rattled him. We reached the top of the gallery steps right outside the massive doors of the courtroom, the final threshold before the judge. Walter stepped into my path, blocking the heavy wooden door. He adjusted his expensive cuffs. He forced a smile, trying to reclaim the power the bailiff had just stripped from him. He wanted to see me break. He needed to see me terrified. I hope you found a comfortable bridge to sleep under tonight. Walter sneered, his voice dripping with venom. Because after today, you are completely done. I stopped. I stood 12 inches from him. I did not argue. I did not defend myself. I looked straight into his eyes. His pupils were blown wide, vibrating slightly from too much caffeine and masked anxiety. The pulse in his neck fluttered erratically. He was weak. He was a loud, empty vessel making noise to hide the hollow space inside. I inhaled. 4 seconds. I held it. 4 seconds. Go inside, Walter. I did not wait for his response. I stepped around his frozen frame, pushed the heavy oak door open, and walked into the courtroom. Courtroom 3 smelled like lemon wood polish, damp wool, and cheap cologne. The overhead air conditioning unit rattled behind a rusted metal grate, a steady mechanical hum that swallowed the sound of people breathing. I sat at the heavy oak defense table. My hands rested flat on the scratched wood. Attorney Coleman paced in front of the judge's empty bench. His patent leather shoes squeaked against the hardwood floor. He was putting on a show for the crowded gallery behind us. He wore a gray suit that was a little too tight across the shoulders, and his hair was slicked back with a gel that looked wet under the harsh fluorescent lights. Your Honor is not present yet, Mr. Coleman. The court reporter muttered, her fingers hovering over her steno machine. You can stop practicing. Coleman smirked and adjusted his tie. He walked back to the plaintiff's table. Walter sat there looking like a tragic victim painted by a master artist. He had a folded silk handkerchief resting on his knee. He kept his shoulders slightly slumped, playing the part of an exhausted, abused elder statesman. Daniel sat next to him, chewing aggressively on his thumbnail, his leg bouncing up and down under the table in a rapid, nervous rhythm. I did not look at them. I kept my eyes fixed on the empty leather chair behind the high wooden bench. The gallery was packed, mostly local bottom feeders hoping to buy foreclosed properties. But in the far back corner, partially hidden by the shadow of the heavy double doors, sat Frank Morrison. Frank was 71, a double amputee from the Ia Drang Valley. He sat in his battered wheelchair, wearing a faded olive drab jacket with a VA patch sewn onto the shoulder. He had dragged himself out of his house, navigated the broken city sidewalks, and wheeled himself into the back of this courtroom just to be here. I did not wave to him. I did not smile. But I saw his hands gripping the metal rims of his wheels. His knuckles were bone white. His jaw was clenched so hard the muscle ticked under his skin. He knew exactly what I had done for this country. He knew what it cost. And he was sitting there forced to swallow the bitter pill of watching a local slimeball lawyer treat me like garbage. The heavy wooden door behind the bench clicked open. All rise, the old bailiff barked. His voice echoed off the high vaulted ceiling. The room scraped and shuffled as everyone got to their feet. Judge Arthur Whitmore walked in. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 60s. The black judicial robe draped over his frame, but it could not hide the rigid, unyielding posture of a man who had spent 3 decades in the United States military. His silver hair was cut close to the scalp. His face looked like it had been carved out of granite with a dull chisel. He climbed the short steps, stood behind his chair, and gave the room a single sweeping look. Be seated. The crowd dropped back onto the hard wooden pews. Whitmore sat. He pulled a pair of reading glasses from his breast pocket and slid them onto his nose. He opened the thick manila folder on his desk. The room went dead silent. The only sound was the harsh rattle of the AC unit and the dry rustle of heavy paper turning. Docket number 429er. Whitmore read, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Walter Hodge seeking an order of eviction against... He stopped. His finger paused halfway down the page. The courtroom held its breath. Whitmore looked up from the file. He lowered his chin, peering over the top rim of his glasses. His eyes swept past Coleman. They bypassed Walter's tragic, downturned face. They ignored Daniel's bouncing leg. His gaze locked onto me. It was a split-second assessment. A predator recognizing another predator in a room full of livestock. He took in the cheap frayed gray blazer. He took in my posture, the perfectly aligned spine, the squared shoulders, the hands resting flat and still. He saw the cold, dead calm in my eyes. It was a look you could not fake. It was a look you only earned by watching people die. Whitmore's hard mouth twitched. A micromillimeter of a smirk. He knew. He didn't know my rank. He didn't know my clearance level. But he smelled the gunpowder and the discipline. He recognized his own kind. I did not smile back. I blinked once, slow and deliberate. Whitmore leaned back in his high leather chair. The springs groaned under his weight. He folded his hands over his stomach. "Proceed, Mr. Coleman." Coleman practically leaped out of his chair. He grabbed a piece of paper and waved it in the air like a bloody flag. "Thank you, Your Honor. This is a very simple, cut-and-dry case. My client, Mr. Walter Hodge, is the sole legal owner of the property located on Elm Street. The defendant, his daughter, is a 61-year-old woman who refuses to vacate the premises. She contributes nothing to the mortgage. She pays no rent. She is, for all intents and purposes, a financial parasite bleeding her elderly father dry." Walter dabbed his eyes with his silk handkerchief. Daniel stopped chewing his nail long enough to shoot me a smug, dirty look across the aisle. "We are asking the court to grant an immediate order of eviction." Coleman pressed on, his voice climbing an octave. "The defendant has a history of emotional instability and refuses to engage in basic rational crack." The wooden gavel hit the sounding block. A sharp, violent gunshot that instantly killed Coleman's momentum. Coleman froze. His mouth hung half open. "Shut your mouth, counselor," Whitmore said. His voice did not rise in volume, but the temperature in the room plummeted. Coleman blinked, lowering his piece of paper. A bead of sweat broke out along his hairline. "Your Honor, I was just outlining the facts of the—" "You're outlining garbage," Whitmore cut him off. He tossed the manila file onto the center of his desk. "I am looking at the property deed you submitted." "Yes, Your Honor. The deed clearly shows Walter Hodge as the primary. The deed shows an incomplete chain of title, Mr. Coleman." Coleman's face went slack. "Excuse me." Walter leaned forward in his chair. The tragic victim act vanished. The silk handkerchief dropped into his lap. "What is he talking about?" Walter hissed at his lawyer. Daniel's legs stopped bouncing. Whitmore took off his reading glasses. He tossed them onto the desk. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the heavy wood. He looked directly at Walter. The disgust in the judge's eyes was raw and unfiltered. "This property has a secondary lien holder," Whitmore stated, his voice ringing through the dead silence of the courtroom. "A blind trust that has been paying the property taxes on that estate for the last 12 years. You cannot evict a resident when you don't even own the dirt under the house." Coleman scrambled. He frantically dug through his leather briefcase, ripping papers out and tossing them onto the table. "That's impossible. The title search came back clean." "Who is the secondary holder?" Whitmore picked up his gavel. "The Hayes Trust Fund." Walter stopped breathing. His jaw went slack. The blood drained entirely out of his face, leaving behind a sick gray pallor. He stared at the judge, his mouth working silently, trying to form words that wouldn't come. "Petition for eviction is denied pending a full financial review," Whitmore announced. Crack. The gavel hit the wood a second time. "Court is adjourned for 2 weeks. Do not waste my time with sloppy paperwork again, Mr. Coleman, or I will hold you in contempt." Whitmore stood up. He did not look at them again. But before he turned to walk through his private door, his eyes flicked to me one last time. A silent salute. I pushed my chair back. It scraped harshly against the floor. My heart rate remained exactly at 60 beats per minute. I stood up. I reached down and slowly, deliberately buttoned the center button of my frayed gray blazer. Walter sat frozen at the plaintiff's table. His eyes were wide with a sudden suffocating terror. He looked at me, realizing for the very first time that the floor beneath his feet was made of glass and it was already shattering. I did not give him a second glance. I turned my back on the bleeding, panicked men at that table, walked straight down the center aisle, and pushed the heavy wooden doors open. The scent of their failure followed me out into the hall. Courtroom 3 was suffocating. Body heat and cheap aftershave packed into the heavy wooden pews. The gallery was standing room only. Word had bled through the Savannah gossip mill that the local real estate king was about to publicly execute his deadbeat daughter. They came for blood. They wanted a show. I sat at the defense table. My gray blazer was pressed. I kept my eyes on the scratched wood grain of the table. I focused on my breathing. Inhale 4 seconds. Hold 4 seconds. Attorney Coleman leaned back in his chair, picking at a piece of lint on his trousers. Walter sat beside him, arms crossed, projecting bored irritation. Daniel tapped his leather shoe against the floor in a rapid, nervous rhythm. Patricia Hale stood up. Her joints popped. She held a thick stack of paper bound by heavy black binder clips. She walked to the center table and dropped the stack. The sound was a dull, heavy thud. It echoed over the low hum of the ceiling vents. "Your Honor," Patricia said. Her voice was rough, scraping like coarse sandpaper. "We are here to resolve the ownership of the property located on Elm Street. Mr. Coleman claims his client owns it. That is a lie." Patricia pushed a heavy watermarked document across the wood. The Hayes Manor was purchased in full in cash in 1998. The buyer was a private defense trust. My client is the sole owner and primary beneficiary of that trust. A low murmur ripped through the gallery. Walter uncrossed his arms. His face dropped. "That is garbage," he barked, entirely forgetting where he was. "She works a government desk. Where the hell did she get that kind of money?" Patricia did not look at Walter. She slowly turned her frail body toward the packed wooden pews. She let the silence stretch. She let it burn into the room. For the past 31 years, Patricia said, her voice dropping an octave, carrying to the very back wall, my client has served in the Office of Naval Intelligence. She has operated in theaters of war that do not exist on civilian maps. The air sucked out of the room. Patricia looked dead at Walter. "Allow me to introduce the sole owner of your house, active duty Rear Admiral of the United States Navy, Olivia Hodge." Complete clinical silence. In the back corner, near the heavy oak doors, the old bailiff reacted. His spine locked. His heavy boots hit the marble floor. He snapped to rigid attention, his hand locked to the seam of his trousers. He did not move. He did not breathe. Daniel staggered backward. His expensive leather shoes slipped on the polished floor. His hip slammed hard against the wooden railing separating the gallery from the floor. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a sick, terrified child. Walter froze. His jaw hung loose. His eyes darted from Patricia to the judge to me. He looked at the frayed cuffs of my gray blazer, the cheap shoes, the lack of jewelry. The brain behind his eyes short-circuited, entirely unable to process the math. He had spent his entire life hunting for power, and he never realized he was sharing a dinner table with it. Judge Whitmore picked up the heavy file. He broke the red wax seal. He read the first page, his face hardening into a solid block of stone. Due to classified military protocols. Whitmore said, his voice flat, "This court will seal the operational history contained in this folder. However, the civilian financial records are a matter of public record. Counselor, proceed." Patricia picked up a stack of single sheets. "You called my client a parasite," Patricia rasped. She peeled the top paper off. She slapped it onto the wood. Smack. 2004, Memorial Hospital, Oncology Wing, $120,000 paid in full for the late Mrs. Hodge, paid by the Hayes Trust. Walter's hand started to shake. Patricia peeled the next paper. Smack. 2008, a $40,000 marker at the Beau Rivage Casino in Biloxi. Paid in cash to keep a loan shark from breaking Daniel Hodge's legs. Paid by the Hayes Trust. Daniel grabbed his chest, his breathing shallow and rapid. He looked at the floor, unable to lift his head. The crowd in the gallery began to whisper. Angry, sharp whispers. The people of Savannah hated a cheat. Patricia peeled a third paper. She slammed it down so hard her knuckles turned white. 2012. Federal tax liens. $65,000 to keep the Internal Revenue Service from seizing Walter Hodge's construction business. Paid by the Hayes Trust. Paper after paper, each one a nail driven straight into the coffin of the Hodge family pride. I looked at the receipts. The gallery saw money. I saw the cost. I saw the hazardous duty pay. I saw the blacked-out transport planes flying low over the Persian Gulf. I saw the copper smell of blood on the sand. I bought their comfortable, arrogant lives with my own physical survival. I paid for Daniel's gambling addiction with the money I earned watching 18-year-old kids bleed out on stretchers. Walter could not stand. He gripped the edge of the plaintiff's table. His knuckles were raw and white. His expensive custom suit looked 3 sizes too big on his suddenly shrunken frame. The tyrant was dead. Only a hollow, terrified old man remained. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the blood pumping in your own ears. Walter slowly turned his head. His eyes were bloodshot, swimming with a mixture of total humiliation and desperate confusion. His lips trembled. Why? Walter's voice broke. It was a weak, pathetic wheeze. You let me pay for your groceries. You let me treat you like... Why did you hide it from me? I did not shift in my chair. I did not raise my chin in victory. There was no victory here. Only the exhaustion of carrying a load I never should have picked up. I looked at the man who had spent 60 years making me feel completely worthless. My eyes traced the deep wrinkles around his mouth. Because, I said. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a surgical blade. You are my father. Walter's grip failed. He collapsed heavily into his leather chair. The marble hallway outside courtroom 3 was chaos. Local reporters shoved recorders and cheap microphones over the wooden banister. The heavy double doors slammed shut behind me, cutting off the low, panicked hum of the gallery. Flashbulbs went off in rapid succession, blinding bursts of white light bouncing off the stone walls. Admiral Hodge, a reporter shouted, elbowing a bailiff. Is it true your father tried to evict you from a property you bought with military hazard pay? I did not break stride. I kept my eyes focused straight ahead. I pushed through the heavy glass doors leading out to the courthouse parking lot. The heat hit me instantly. A thick, wet blanket of Georgia summer air. Daniel was waiting by the front steps. His leased BMW was parked illegally in the loading zone. His tie was ripped loose. His expensive dress shirt was soaked with sweat under the armpits. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire fake reality burn to the ground. You set him up, Daniel hissed, stepping into my path. His voice was ragged. He pointed a shaking finger at my face. You let him walk into that courtroom looking like a fool. You made him look weak. Why didn't you just tell us you had the money? I stopped. I did not square my shoulders. I did not need to. I just looked at him. I looked at the dark bags under his eyes, the desperation leaking out of his pores. Did you ever ask where the 40 grand for the Biloxi casino came from, Daniel? I asked. My voice was flat, barely above a whisper. Or did you just cash the check so you could keep playing pretend? Daniel's mouth opened. No sound came out. He knew. Deep down in the ugly, selfish part of his brain, he had always known the money didn't come from Walter's failing construction business. But ignorance was comfortable. Ignorance kept him in tailored suits. His knees buckled. Not a dramatic collapse, just a slow, pathetic failure of muscle. He hit the hot asphalt of the parking lot, his hands flat on the blacktop. He did not look up. The successful businessman was gone. Only a broke, middle-aged addict remained kneeling in the dirt. I walked around him and got into my car. Walter did not return to the Hayes Manor. His pride could not survive the humiliation. He packed a single suitcase and rented a cheap weekly motel room out on Highway 80. A place that smelled like stale cigarette smoke, mildewed carpets, and pine sol. He was stripped of his audience, stripped of his power. He had spent 82 years feeding on the fear and respect of his family. Now he was entirely alone in a room with peeling wallpaper and a buzzing neon sign flashing through the thin curtains. The human body can only process so much toxic shame before the internal plumbing simply gives out. The stroke hit him 3 days later. Sometime around 2 in the morning, a massive clot in the left hemisphere of his brain. Memorial Hospital smelled like rubbing alcohol, bleach, and bad coffee. I stood in the doorway of the intensive care unit. The overhead fluorescent lights buzzed with a low, annoying hum. The heart monitor beeped in a steady synthetic rhythm. I walked into the room. I was not wearing my faded gray blazer. I was wearing my service dress blues, the heavy navy fabric. The gold stripes on the sleeves, the ribbons stacked on my chest. I wore it because I had just come from a briefing at the naval base. But standing in this sterile room, the uniform felt heavier than it ever had. Walter lay in the center of the bed. He looked tiny, shrunken. The massive, booming tyrant who had slammed his fist on my dining room table was gone. He was just a frail 82-year-old man drowning in white hospital sheets. A clear plastic oxygen tube looped under his nose. A maze of IV lines fed into his bruised, paper-thin arms. His eyes were closed. His chest rose and fell in shallow, jagged jerks. I stood at the foot of the bed. I didn't say anything. I just watched the monitor trace the electrical signals of his failing heart. Walter stirred. His eyelids fluttered. They opened slowly, fighting against the heavy sedation. His cloudy, bloodshot eyes drifted around the sterile room before locking onto me. He stared at the gold stripes on my sleeves. He stared at the rigid posture, the uniform of a United States admiral. The right side of his face sagged, paralyzed by the stroke, but the left side broke. A single tear escaped his eye, cutting a slow path through the deep wrinkles on his cheek. It wasn't a tear of physical pain. It was the crushing weight of absolute regret. He tried to lift his right hand. It barely twitched. He lifted his left hand instead, his liver-spotted fingers trembling violently as he reached across the starched white blanket. He reached for my sleeve. I stepped closer to the side of the bed. I did not pull away. His cold, bony fingers brushed against the heavy wool of my uniform. He gripped it weakly. His breathing turned ragged. He swallowed hard, struggling against the dry tube in his nose. "I'm sorry." His voice was a broken rasp, a dry leaf scraping across concrete. "I punished you." Walter wheezed, his eyes welling up with more tears. "I punished you because you became everything I couldn't." I stared down at him. The military discipline, the box breathing, the years of suppressing trauma in active war zones. None of it worked in this room. The armor cracked. The little girl who just wanted her father to look at her without disappointment bled right through the navy blue fabric. Walter closed his eyes. He swallowed the thick knot in his throat. "I am proud of you." My lower lip trembled. I clamped my teeth down to stop it. I reached out and covered his cold, trembling hand with mine. Winter in Savannah is a damp, bone-chilling cold that creeps right off the marsh water. It ignores your coat and settles deep into the joints. Daniel didn't have the heated leather seats of his leased BMW anymore. That got repossessed in late September. He drove a rusted 2006 Ford pickup with a cracked windshield and a heater that blew cold air. Every morning at 4:30, he drove down to the port of Savannah. The air down there always smelled like diesel fuel, salt, and dead fish. He wore a heavy canvas jacket and steel-toed boots. He hauled freight on the loading docks, 12-hour shifts of raw, brutal labor. He listened to the deafening crash of steel shipping containers slamming onto the concrete. His muscles tore and rebuilt themselves. He lost 20 pounds of liquor weight. His soft, manicured hands blistered, popped, and eventually turned into thick yellow calluses. 2 nights a week, he sat in the damp cinder block basement of a Methodist church. He drank terrible powdered coffee in a circle of broken men, looking at his boots, admitting out loud that he was a gambling addict. He lost his fake empire. But for the first time in 30 years, Daniel slept through the night without waking up in a cold sweat. He earned his sleep. Walter moved back into the Hayes Manor, not the massive master suite upstairs. He couldn't manage the grand staircase anymore. The stroke left his left leg dragging heavily behind him, his shoe constantly scuffing the hardwood floors. His left arm remained curled tight against his ribcage. I put him in the converted ground floor study. The shouting stopped. The booming, arrogant voice of the construction tyrant died in that hospital bed. Now he sat in a vinyl chair by the window. Quiet, just listening. Sometimes Frank Morrison would wheel his chair over and talk about the suffocating humidity in the Ia Drang Valley, or the metallic smell of blood on a slick jungle floor. Walter just nodded. He didn't interrupt. He didn't brag about his old building contracts. He just absorbed the heavy silence of men who had actually bled for something real. I didn't sell the house. I tore down the invisible walls instead. I signed the legal paperwork in early October. Hayes Manor officially became the Hayes Veterans Retreat, a halfway point for discharged soldiers navigating the dark maze of PTSD and young widows trying to figure out how to pay the electric bill alone. The massive property smelled different now. The stale scent of expensive cigars and catered food was permanently gone, replaced by the sharp, clean smell of freshly cut pine boards, wood glue, and sawdust. The cold air rang with the rhythmic, heavy thwack of a framing hammer hitting galvanized nails. Walter refused to sit idle. He dragged his bad leg out to the wraparound porch every single afternoon. He held a block of heavy grit sandpaper in his good right hand. He spent hours scraping the decades of thick, baked-on rust off the wrought iron railings. The iron dust coated his fingers. His knuckles cracked and bled. The freezing wind made his eyes water constantly. But he didn't stop. He didn't ask for pity or a glass of water. He was grinding away his guilt through raw physical labor. He was finally putting his stubborn pride in the exact right place, serving the people who had fallen apart so he could earn his right to live in peace. Veterans Day arrived with a pale golden sun hanging low in the sky. We gathered in the backyard under the massive branches of the old oak tree, draped in thick, gray Spanish moss. About 30 people stood on the dead grass, men leaning on aluminum crutches, women holding framed photographs of flag-draped caskets. Walter stood up from his folding chair. He leaned heavily on a four-pronged aluminum cane. His breath plumed white in the cold air. The stroke made his jaw slack, making it incredibly hard for him to form the words. But he refused to sit down. He looked at the quiet crowd, then he looked directly at me. "My daughter," Walter rasped. His voice shook violently, but the volume held steady. "My daughter spent her entire life protecting people who did not deserve it. People who treated her like dirt. Me included." He swallowed hard. His knuckles turned pure white on the foam handle of his cane. "She is the strongest person I have ever known. And I wasted my entire life being too stupid and too proud to admit it. I am a small, foolish man. She is a giant." He dropped his chin to his chest. A single tear broke loose and hit the dry winter grass. I didn't let him stand there alone. I walked across the lawn. I wrapped my arms around his frail, shaking shoulders. The heavy wool of my sweater pressed against his worn flannel shirt. He leaned his head against my shoulder and let out a long, ragged breath. He surrendered. The applause started slowly. Then it swelled. A loud echoing sound rolling across the marsh, drowning out the ghosts of our past. Late afternoon. The sky bruised into deep shades of purple and burnt orange. I stood alone on the back porch. I held a thick ceramic mug of black coffee. The bitter steam rose into the freezing air, warming my face. My eyes automatically swept the tree line, left to right, checking the deep shadows, scanning the blind spots. It was a habit etched permanently into my DNA. But the hard, suffocating knot in my chest was finally gone. I wasn't looking for a hidden threat anymore. I was just watching the dry leaves fall. I took a slow sip of the scalding coffee. It burned the back of my throat. It felt good. You see, the world tells you that a soldier's greatest victory is crushing the enemy into dust, wiping them off the map, proving your absolute dominance until there is nothing left but scorched earth and silence. That is a lie. When you have walked through the fire, you learn the real truth. The greatest victory a soldier can ever achieve isn't destroying the people who hurt you. It is having the absolute power to annihilate them and choosing to forgive their weakness instead. It is carrying the heavy load so the broken ones can finally rest. The savannah wind rushed through the oak branches, cold and clean. Everything was finally quiet. If this story moved you, please hit the like button, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for listening to my journey. I will see you next time.